I'm here today with Sanjeev Sanyal. He's had a phenomenal career in finance and currently serves as the principal economic advisor to the government of India. He's also the author of 4 very highly rated books on India. And Professor Sanyal, I'd like to ask you, what do you think is India's national and international potential? And what is holding us back and what could potentially be fixed in the next 5 years?
I mean, as I've extensively written, India has of course been free for 70 years, but it's really in the 1990s that something stirred amongst us, inside us, that completely changed the direction. Of course, there was the 1991 opening up of the economy, but it was not just an opening up of the economy, it signifies in some way an opening up of our mind as well. And you begin to see that shift. So around about the end of that decade is when, if you see, all our economic and other numbers here really begin to take off at that time. So as we speak, we have gone back to being, in US dollar terms, the 5th largest economy in the world, just overtaking the UK. Now, just to put it in perspective, this is after 170 years that our economy in US dollar terms, that is in raw economic power, not in some adjusted PPP terms, in raw economic power, has overtaken that of Britain. So in a sense, this is finally wiping out that colonial legacy, so to speak. But that much of that change has happened just in the last 2 decades. So the interesting thing, as far as I'm concerned, why didn't it happen earlier? It could have happened, Korea, China, even the rebuilding of Japan and many others in the rest of Asia happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Why did we wait for such a long time? After all the institutions of democracy and many other things that were there. And I would argue that while there are specific issues, dynastic rule and so on, but the really interesting issue as far as I am concerned is the opening of mind. That was a real problem. We did not succeed because we believed that as a poor country somehow we couldn't. And so he had this peculiar situation that before independence, Indians were actually able to win Nobel Prizes while being based in India, in physics, in literature, and so on. But since independence, quite extraordinary. No Indian based in India has won a Nobel Prize in any field of study. And I'm not counting the peace Nobels, for the simplest reason while they may be great individuals, they represent our failures as a society. But why is it that Indians living abroad are able to do it, but not in India? Largely because we simply got trapped into this povertarian mindset that we couldn't succeed. So even that one hockey gold that we used to win, even that we stopped winning. And that mindset change begins to happen in the 90s, gathers pace in the 2000s. Now that it is really there, that confidence that we can do it. We have still some way to go, but I think this is an important part of the change, a sort of ending of a mental jail that we had put ourselves in, and that jail. There are many reasons why we ended up at it. It may be the long, hundreds of years of colonial domination or whatever it is, but we have finally begun to push against it and break through it. It's a still half-finished job. Large parts of our intellectual elite still suffer from some sort of a collective Stockholm syndrome. But I think finally the ship is turning.
And what's holding us back, do you think, from getting to a still higher rate of growth, or something else which is a roadblock for India in some sense?
Well, of course, it's a conversation for it's a much longer conversation. There are many reforms we need to do as an economy, for example. Yeah. In the last 2 years, we have done some major reforms. GST, the cleaning up of the banks, insolvency and bankruptcy code, giving everybody an Aadhaar number and so on. So these are major reforms. The benefits of which will come over decades, even generations. But the imposition of these changes at every stage is painful. So we cannot do too many of these reforms in one shot. So we have to do it in a sequential way, slowly, so that the people get used to it. Even the large number of changes we did last year did cause disruption to the business sector, particularly to the medium and small enterprises. We cannot keep loading them with more and more change. So you have to let it settle. So there are a lot more changes that we need to do. But if I was taking some of the big changes we need to do over the next 5 to 10 years, I would argue getting our legal system to work has got to be the most important. But by that I don't just mean the judiciary, but the whole ecosystem of the legal, on the legal front. Because I would argue that enforcement of contracts is the single biggest constraint in the Indian economy today. There are many other constraints that used to exist in the past, but now this has become a very important constraint. The second big constraint is that our administrative system is now simply creaking. It is totally unsuitable for a 21st century economy. The economy that already exists, not the one we want to make, already for what already exists, our administrative system is unsuitable. So we need to now begin getting serious about administrative reforms. This range of things that we need to do, how we recruit, how we carry out policing and law and order, how we make decisions in our bureaucracy. There's a whole gamut of things. A large number of committees have sat and discussed this. So it's not the lack of ideas that is the problem, but we need to relook at it and begin doing some of those changes.
Does the government recognize that it's become, in a sense, a bit too large?
So this is an important issue that you've raised. The role of the state is an important part of what we need to think about. And in this context, you have to see Prime Minister Modi, what he's been trying to do. He promised minimum government, maximum governance. Now, in order to have governance, you cannot simply withdraw the state. You have to first create the framework of governance. So we have spent a lot of effort in the last few years creating those frameworks. What are those frameworks of governance? For example, on the monetary side, we have created a monetary policy committee. So it's an institutionalized framework. The insolvency and bankruptcy code, that's an institutional framework for undoing business sort of failures. GST is a framework for taxation, and not just for indirect taxation. It collects a huge amount of material. The idea is to change the taxation culture and business culture of the country. So these are frameworks. Once these are in place, you can slowly begin to withdraw the state from intrusiveness. So you've just seen one example of that. As we have got this new taxation system and allowed it to settle, we've also now begun to withdraw a lot of the unnecessary litigation and appeals that the government itself used to do, this inherent. So we have dramatically increased the ceilings up to which you can you can appeal for tax litigation. So that withdrawal is also happening. But one important thing is, while I am a votary for a small state, but I am also a votary for a strong state, i.e., those things the government is supposed to do, it should do well. So I'm not a votary of a libertarian state with a very weak, small government. No. I do want a state. There are many things the state should be doing and should do a good job of it, rather than interfere in the daily life, sort of a weak but all-pervasive state that we have ended up with. So for this, we need to do those judicial and administrative reforms. Without that, it's not going to happen. In fact, the few things the state should be doing is administering justice, enforcing contracts, and so on. And we fail at doing this. So that is where we should pay attention.
Changing track a little bit, what do you feel is India's true swabhava? What is India's heritage and gift to the world?
So we have a long, long history as a civilization. We are a civilizational nation with, 7,000 years odd history, and perhaps even more. And through that long history, of course, we have imbibed a lot of things from the rest of the world. We've contributed a lot of things to the world, and there's a lot many discussions have happened in the past about our contributions in mathematics and medicine, our pivotal role in world trade over millennia. And as you may already know, that for long periods of ancient and medieval history, India alone accounted for a third of the world economy. And it was, effectively trading with the Romans, trading with the Chinese, and so on for long, long periods of time. So we have had many roles in the world, intellectually, economically, and so on. However, I think the very interesting part is the basis of all of this has been a peculiar and interesting view of our civilization, which goes back to the very beginning of our civilization. So if you go back to the very beginning of our civilization, what is the earliest political event that we genuinely know about? The earliest political event that we know about is a tribe called the Bharatas, led by a chieftain called Sudas and his guru, Vasishtha. They faced with a crisis, which is that 10 tribes from Punjab are invading them. So this tribe lived in and around what is now southern Haryana, on the banks of the Saraswati River. And they're attacked by this coalition of 10 tribes led by the Rishi Vishwamitra. And there's a great battle on the banks of the Ravi, in which the Bharatas, despite being totally outnumbered, they completely decimate the enemy. And this begins the first known empire that India ever known. The Bharatas then looked eastward and they defeated a tribe or a chieftain called Bheda on the banks of the Yamuna, and therefore they ended up controlling a sizable chunk of area. Difficult to say when this happened, but my own guess is this is pre-Harappan period, very early Bronze Age. Now, the next thing that happens is very interesting. You see, throughout Indian human history, it is not uncommon that the ruling or the victorious power then imposes on everybody all its own views and says that this is, our gods are stronger than your gods, and therefore you now have to worship our gods, and the demonstration of that is, of course, that we won the battle against you. Now the Bharatas, however, do something totally different. They actually get everybody from these defeated tribes, and even perhaps from people who they didn't have any, they didn't rule over, just happened to be neighbors or even further out. But the best minds of the time they invited, and they began to put down their thoughts and ideas, rituals, etc. into one place. And that is what has come down to us as the Vedic Samhitas. Now the Vedic Samhitas are therefore very, very interesting because they are not just the thoughts of Vasishtha. They include the thoughts of any of the other tribes, including those of the defeated tribe and of Vishwamitra. In fact, Vishwamitra is a very important character in the Rig Veda, even though he would have been, if a member of the defeated 10 tribes, a leader of the defeated 10 tribes. And then what they do is they put this all together, and therefore they create a template for our civilization, but more specifically, of course, Hinduism, which is that idea of assimilation and plurality rather than of imposition. And this is very explicitly written. It's not something that I am sort of superimposing backwards. This is also not something that happened just by chance. I mean, the plurality of Indic culture and of Hinduism is well known, but it is not as if it is just that how it happened to be by chance. Those who set about it in the beginning understood the power of this plurality and consequently hardwired it in some ways into the underlying system of Sanatana Dharma. And the best place to see it explicitly written out is the very last hymn of the Rig Veda, where it says, "Come together, speak together, just like the old gods all sit at their apportioned places around the sacrificial fire. Come assemble together, bring all your diverse thoughts together." So there is a clear message going, bring all your thoughts. All your gods have a place around the sacrificial fire. This is not an exclusivist culture. This has space for all of you. All we have done through the Rig Veda is create a template, a framework, so that we can stop unnecessary conflict and instead have a system of allowing different points of view to flourish.
In fact, yes, it speaks tremendously of the collective harmony that we should aspire to.
Yes, and then it's quite interesting. In the end, let's remember, this is a civilization that has existed more or less intact, despite a lot of efforts, by the way, to destroy it. It has come down and still survives, the oldest living civilization in the world by some margin. And the extraordinary part of it is some of its earliest writings, including the Rig Veda, are still in active use today. Millions of Hindus get up every morning and chant the Gayatri Mantra, which was composed in the early Bronze Age. Just think about it. And it has survived basically because of this complex, adaptive framework, which allows for continuous updation and accumulation of ideas.
You've had a very deep interdisciplinary interest in history. I was wondering if you could comment on how history should be approached in our schools and what would you suggest should be changed in our curricula?
So there are many problems with our history, but as I have spoken in many other forums, one of the major problems of our history is that the history we read is not our history at all. It is really a retelling of invaders who invaded India and ruled over us. It is not our story. So this is why you have this peculiar situation. You read our Indian history, you will see a clear retelling of battles that the invaders won. Almost all the battles that the Indians won against the invaders are actually edited out and was systematically done. So that's why you never hear about the Battle of Kolachal, you don't hear about the battle at Bahraich and many other events. You also do not hear in our own history books, even 70 years after independence, you don't barely any talk about, Ahilyabai Holkar, Rani Durgavati, and so on, and the story of Mewar's heroic resistance against the sultans and the Mughals, or the Ahoms and their resistance against waves, particularly of Mughal invasions into their kingdoms in the northeast. So the point is, why are these stories not in our storybooks? In every other country, they tell the story from their perspective. I mean, history can be told from different perspectives, but why not from the Indian perspective? Yeah, there's nothing shameful about it. Our perspective is also a perspective, and why shouldn't we tell it? But our history books are simply not shown, and that's because we have taken it layer upon layer by taking a colonial view of history, adding on it an Nehruvian view of history, then a Marxist layer of history, and therefore we have accumulated a sequence of biases to the extent that our history no longer makes sense. And it doesn't fit with any of the evidence or our own folk memory of the sequence of events. So now we need to do something about it. Now there's a long discussion which we don't need to get into here about rewriting of our history books. And any attempt, by the way, to do it inevitably finds that, a lot of screaming and shouting about introducing right-wing biases, so to speak. And one has to be careful about that too. Just replacing one bunch of lies with another bunch of lies is also doesn't serve a purpose. What we need to do is to have a proper evidence-based retelling of our story from our perspective, but it has to be evidence-based. And once this is retold, we should also remember that, like any other field, even history is not a static field. New evidence is found, you find it from archaeology, you find it from genetics, new texts are found, new ways of thinking about the world happen, climate sciences give you all kinds of insights into early history and so on. So all of these new ideas need to be continuously updated into our thinking about ourselves.
Thank you. And what are you reading at present, or are you writing a new book?
Well, I'm very, very busy these days, so it's very difficult for me to think about even writing a new book. I did publish a book very recently called Life Over 2 Beers. It's my first book of fiction. It's a series of satirical short stories. But I had written that well earlier. All I did during the last year was edit it. I wouldn't have had time to actually write a new book. Nevertheless, at some point, I have an aspiration to write a book on the story of the Indian freedom struggle as seen from the perspective of the revolutionaries. The Indian revolutionary movement was not some series of brave people carrying out somewhat unconnected acts of rebellion. It was a very well-established, well-interconnected movement lasting over half a century with very, very prominent people, including Sri Aurobindo, since we are in Pondicherry, but many others, the Raj Bihari Bose, Sachindranath Sanyal, you had Bhagat Singh, you had towards the very end of it, of course, Netaji, Subhash Bose. So the story of the armed resistance to British colonization and occupation is a story that needs to be told, and it comes out, the whole story then looks fundamentally different from what we are told in our official narrative. And it may come out as being quite uncomfortable for both the British and the Congress party's telling of the story.
Okay, good luck with that. And what do you feel about the Pondi Lit Fest? Would you come back again?
Absolutely, it's one of the best festivals I've been to. I've been to quite a few. I mean, for a first attempt, this is simply amazing. You're already out there as one of the best festivals in India, perhaps even worldwide. This is right at the cutting edge. And to have done it in your very first attempt is absolutely amazing.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.